Hello and welcome to Minter Dialogue, episode number 387. Today is Sunday the 6th of September 2020. My name is Minter Dial and I'm your host for this podcast. This week's interview is with Bindi Karia. Bindi's an innovation expert, advising companies, startups, investors, and governmental bodies on how to push the innovation agenda. In this conversation with Bindi, we discuss the state of innovation, some of the important tech trends, including deep tech, as well as how companies can ramp up their innovation efforts and monetize intellectual property. You'll find all the show notes on minterdial.com. Please do consider to drop in your rating and review, and don't forget to subscribe to catch all the future episodes. Now for the show. Bindi Karia, listen, great to have you on the show. You and I have crossed wires many times, digitally and in real life. We have a lot of people in common. Yet you do a part of business that I certainly don't know much about. So I'm really intrigued to find out. You also are very multicultural. I like to consider myself somewhat multicultural, but not in your league with so many distant things. I looked at your Instagram account with your Canadian side. You've got your Indian, Kenyan background. And so you're a very intriguing person. In your own words, how would you like to describe yourself?
Oh gosh, that's a big question. I think I'd just like to say maybe, and this isn't really politically correct these days, but I guess I'm a child of the Commonwealth, the British Commonwealth. So my parents and grandparents are from Kenya. My great-grandfathers immigrated across to Kenya on the British boats, in the same time that Gandhi did in, early 1900s. So we've actually, our family's been in Kenya for a long time. And then my dad actually came to university from Kenya to the UK. So he was in Manchester and went to med school, went back, married my mother, and then they came back here. And that's where I was born. And when I was about a little bit over 5, my father fell in love with the Rockies because his best friend from childhood in Kenya was working in the oil patch in Alberta. So off we went to a very small farm town in between Edmonton and Calgary in Alberta. So that was
Red Deer.
It was by Red Deer, so it's a small town near Red Deer. It's about a 40-minute drive east of Red Deer.
That's all I know that exists between Edmonton and Calgary.
Red Deer would be the nearest sort of big city to us, and Red Deer is a small town compared to Edmonton and Calgary. It's called Stettler, actually. So I actually went to school there, but I did hop to Kenya a couple of times in that period and ended up going to school there as well. So I kind of did my early schooling in sort of Kenya and Canada. And then I was at university in Canada, but I always had the British passport and the love of all things Great Britain, just because a lot of my family was still here. London is halfway. Dad is one of 8 people, so one of 8 siblings. And a lot of them are in the US. We're the only ones in Canada. We had a bunch in the UK, a bunch in Kenya. So London to me always represented halfway, the halfway place to meet all my family, because everybody comes through London. And that also, I didn't get my Canadian passport till I was over 14. So I was always British first. And there was a point in life traveling where my father and mother had to give up their British overseas passports, so they chose Canadian. They had to choose Kenyan or the country they were living, so they both chose Canadian. My brother was born there. So I was the only one on a British passport, and the 3 of them were on a Canadian passport. So it's kind of wild in that time frame, traveling around. But yeah, UK was always in my heart. And so I came back home. I finished university, literally the last day of class I came back. So everything I've ever done career-wise has always been in London, actually. I just sort of felt like I was coming back home. So
I feel the same. Isn't that funny?
Yeah. Excellent. Tell me more about where you were born.
Well, I was born in Belgium. And I've changed countries 15 times. And certainly I've roamed around, but I've come back to roost, if you will, in London.
Yeah. Something about that city that gets under your skin, isn't it?
It is.
Yeah. It's home.
So one of the things that intrigues me about you, Bindi, is you are so involved in innovation. You're on gazillions, I want to say, of advisory boards. It's amazing set of companies with which you're working. I was wondering, in Bindi's mind, what excites you these days? What are the activities in specifically, I suppose, within innovation that excites Bindi?
I mean, that's a big question. So I think a lot of people don't know how to put me in a box, and I don't like to put myself in a box. So I think that that question is putting me in a tiny box. But what I'd love to say is there's something I'm learning a lot more about is being a talented generalist, which means you kind of tried and worked in so many different things over your life that you really you don't necessarily become deep insightful and stuff, but you really are able to pick up something in a category and learn it very, very quickly. And for me, I would say a generalist in innovation is what I love. And I segmented my world, I'm saying the word box, but into sort of four pillars or four boxes. And I would say innovation from the point of view of corporates, from startups, so startup founders, from venture capitalists as they invest, and then actually government policy and government innovation and how they're really trying to impact it. And I think the interaction between the four of them, and for me, because I speak all four languages very well, and I can go in and I can speak the language of the corporate innovation or corporate venture executive, and I can tell them, well, this is actually how the startup CEO or the venture capital partner is thinking, or the government policymaker is thinking, because I've spent so much time sitting on advisory boards or working with my sleeves rolled up. And actually, in the last couple of years, I've also extended that to universities because I'm also a governor, which is basically a board member at the University of East London. So now it's looking at how students and universities fit into that innovation ecosystem as well. So I think for me, it's about ecosystems, it's about corporate, startup, investor, government, and now a little bit more about university, and connecting any one of those four, because I speak those languages, and then actually realizing that there's going to be a commercial success. So venture capital, it's about the deal and bringing in the right company, and the right company that matches the investment hypothesis of the venture capital fund. The startup CEO understanding when they're fundraising, for example, well, who are the VCs should they approach? Or maybe they should strike a strategic partnership with a corporate, or maybe they go for a government grant because it's too soon to be giving up their equity and their products not quite yet ready for, a venture or a corporate partnership or a venture investment. So it's actually really diving into what I guess what they're thinking, and then being able to translate that across different borders. And I think that fits in well with just me being very global and international and growing up multicultural. Even though I'm 100% Indian, I am British, I am Canadian. The only time I freak out is when Great Britain and Canada would play against each other in the Olympics. I just can't choose. I tend to get very paralyzed with, oh my gosh, I don't know who to choose.
Well,
Uh,
the way I roll on that is I go for the underdog.
yeah,
If you're playing hockey, ice hockey, for example,
we have to choose Great Britain, right?
right? Because I mean, if they score a goal, that would be brilliant.
Yeah, but I don't think so. Hockey is Canada's national sport, so I don't think I could ever not support Canada. But let's think of other sports like volleyball in London 2012. UK and Canada did play each other, and I was like, oh God, I don't know who to support. And I think they both were equally as bad as each other. So that was quite fun. But yeah, but also the other thing is culturally, I'm Indian, so there's the hardworking nature. There's always been a focus from all of our families on academic and science and all of that. So I think there's always been that sort of, and that drive to be successful, and that drive to be an entrepreneur, because my grandfathers and great grandfathers were entrepreneurs, and dad was a doctor, but even he had to be entrepreneurial to make it work from Kenya to UK to Canada, and just set up in each country. So I think the whole thread underlining all of this is innovation, but it's also entrepreneurship. You kind of have to be an entrepreneur and a hustler to make things work. So
When you look at what I meant by with all these advisory board positions you have, it gives you a certain regard and an insight into what's happening in the world of innovation. And what I was wanting to find out was what excites you in the world of innovation.
Right now, I can go quite deep quite quickly. And what I would say is, I think the more deeper, complicated technology side of things. So when I see a deep tech deal come through the door, in my venture partner role, or when I'm talking to a deep tech founder, or when a corporate is looking at, innovating in that space or trying to partner with someone in that space, or government's looking to fund it. I just love that. I really, really geek out because it's solving a super complex problem. I've just picked up a client in the last couple of days, so I have a really hefty summer project, which is trying to commercialize a piece of IP from a consulting firm. And the IP is like 4 years in the making. So they've created it for many of their clients. And now they're like, there's something super commercial in this, and we need to spin it out. We need to create a business. We need to create an investment case. We need to set up a whole new company. And that is just super exciting for me. Some projects like that, where you just roll your sleeves up and you set something up. And, in the same like what I did at Silicon Valley Bank or at Microsoft, I was building new businesses for both of them when I was working there. So I think I'm excited about the concept of new business, deep technology, and seeing how that, changes the world. And I love that. I just geek out and get excited by it every single time.
So what is deep technology? Explain to us the interest within deep technology.
I think it's just a really, and this is me just saying it very simply, it's just a very complex combination of tech in general. So it is, if you look at artificial intelligence and how it applies to chatbots and how it applies to voice, well, actually, how do humans and machines interact with each other? And that's actually very complex. So for example, you can ask the machine, I need coffee, and the coffee machine produces the coffee, but there might be 10,000 ways, or 10,000 is too much, but there might be 500 ways to ask for coffee. And the machine has to be smart enough to know that you're, as a human, asking these 500 different ways, and be smart enough to understand that you want coffee. And actually, it's a very complicated problem for that coffee machine and the software underlining it to, create that. And so it is sort of the integration of all of that. So that's one good example. So chatbots and conversational UI and voice technology, is a scenario.
And it's a fascinating thing to follow for sure. I was talking to the folks at Descript who help to transcribe audio into text. And one of the difficulties they had was identifying the word, the filler words,
Yeah, exactly.
And you would have thought that, comma, as in, well, what, and then phrase that continues, as opposed to, well, a lot about a certain topic,
Yeah.
which is a perfectly useful use of, and yet that is very difficult for them
Yeah.
to
Well,
100% identify.
exactly. And I think that it's sort of that human machine interaction. So the zeros and the ones to not just language, so saying it in French or English or Spanish or Gujarati, which is my parents' mother tongue. It's actually in the dialect as well. So will they understand my dad, for example, who has a crazy Canadian, Kenyan, Indian, British accent combined, and he has a Google Home, and it just doesn't understand him. It's hilarious, just we occasionally record our father talking to the Google device, and it's so funny what the device thinks it's asked for. So it's such a complicated problem. And I think the way that we're trying to get machines to help us with so much more. I mean, most of my home nowadays is controlled by, I'll say this quietly, Alexa, because it's just by my laptop up here.
Yes, Bindi, what can I do for you?
And so, I can, turn on my lights or turn on my heating or whatever. And I think that's really interesting. So
When you so looking at innovation in this space, I was much more just vertical in one small little industry.
yeah,
I have that experience, but you have a very broad array that you've been following.
yeah.
I was wondering how innovation has changed, if at all, over the last, let's say, 5 to 10 years.
I think innovation is about identifying what the wave of change is and what the wave of, how do I describe it? There's a problem that needs to be fixed, and the innovators go, we're going to fix it. So 10 years ago, you know, the iPhone came out in what, 2007? And so by about 2009, 2010, we're really starting to get into the app world and app ecosystem and mobile, and all of that. And now you fast forward to today, and you have artificial intelligence and chatbots and voice-enabled technologies. So I think innovation to me is around what is shifting us forward at that period in time. So, 10 years ago, if you look at how investors work, investors invest in the waves. So right now, let's think about us in COVID. Actually, Zoom, look at, we're talking right now over Zoom. And who would have thought, like, they would have had the share price they've had? Who would have thought they would have come to the level of, I guess, market penetration they've had? But needs must. So I think the future of work is going to call for a lot of innovations. And I feel that the times we're in right now, some of the most innovative companies have come out of recessions and downturns. Google was in the noughties and Microsoft was in the 70s. And, out of every downturn, there is some form of innovation and technology to propel us to the next. And I think Industry 4 is another good example of that. So sort of smart manufacturing processes. And again, this is a year old now, but when I was at Mobile World Congress in 2019, because obviously 2020 was canceled due to the pandemic, for me, the most interesting thing was to observe that even in 2018, we weren't there yet, but by 2019, it was full on 5G demos everywhere, smart cars absolutely everywhere, and so many automotive manufacturers, way more than there were there in 2017, but also Industry 4. So just seeing Nokia, who used to be a phone provider, but here's Nokia in the same traditional spot they have in Hall, I think they're usually in Hall 3, and actually it was all Industry 4 and the future of manufacturing facilities and how the Nokia technologies are kitting out these facilities. So actually I find that going to a lot of these large scale people heavy technology events, you really learn a lot about innovation. So for me, I'm always geeking out. And I remember again in 2019, Hall 7, I was geeking out about graphene, which was invented in Manchester. And actually, what is the use case for graphene? And we're still trying to figure that out. And I think that's the thing, for example, with deep tech, investors are like, we're going to invest in it, but when is it actually going to come to market? When is it actually going to be commercializable? And is that a word? I don't even know. But
Yeah, it sounds good. I
yeah,
understand it.
but when can we commercialize it? And it takes a long time before they get revenue. And so to me, that's very, very interesting,
Mm.
is geeking out on all of those type of things.
Well, in what I was thinking about was to what extent, for example, valuations or concepts of ethics and purpose might have come into the way innovation is being orchestrated, evaluated either from a government, even a small company, startup, or a corporate company. Are those elements starting to play into the way people are innovating as well?
Well, it's quite interesting because if you look at the kind of trouble that Twitter and Facebook have been getting into recently, and if you look at the role companies like that allegedly played in the 2016 Trump elections or in our Brexit elections, Brexit referendum in 2016, what role did that have? And if you look at the role of players like that now with the spread of fake news, and finally Twitter's starting to say things like this might be fake news, right? And how it's showing bias, I think it's really created for lack of a better word, it's just created a divide, the liberal left and the the polarized right. So it's really interesting. I think technology and more is coming in that space. So I think actually, yes, we need to start thinking about an ethical executive. I actually wrote an article for City AM Minter that I'll send to you, and feel free to post in this.
Sure.
But is the ethical executive the next big thing? And if you think about it, artificial intelligence is a great example of that. So I can't remember who it was. So you please don't quote me on this. Was it Google? Was it Microsoft? And they ran a face recognition software, and it was very interesting because the darker the skin color was, the worse it became of mistaking, faces for each other.
Yeah.
And if you think about how that crosses into ethics and racism, and now the Black Lives Matter movement, and I'm a minority female, so I've always encountered this kind of racism, especially in the part of Canada I was in. But how does technology play into that? So absolutely, there's room for that. I think we have to become more ethical, and I'm very much a strong proponent of a role in the enterprise called the Chief Ethics Officer. And I'm not talking compliance and all of that boring stuff. I'm
Sure.
talking about someone saying, is this the right thing to do? Are we building our AI in a way that only suits the needs of middle-aged white men because that's who's building the product? Or are we building an AI that suits the needs of humanity? And actually think about the pandemic right now, and getting access to the vaccines. Who's going to get access to that immediately? And so I do think there is a strong need for that. I think some of the more woke corporates are waking up to it. So Salesforce, for example, I forget the role title, but it's sort of a chief ethics something or another. And again, we'll have to look that up. But she reports directly into Benioff, and she's focused on how products are developed from an ethical perspective, but also how are they sold, how are they deployed, to the market. And, she's providing that kind of sort of nudge in the ear of the chief executive. So I don't think we're there yet, but I do think it's a role of the future. And I do think we need to be much more self-aware as executives in this space and as innovators in this space, because we are becoming quite dystopian. I quite frankly think. Now, I wouldn't have said this even a year ago. Now, anything I read on Facebook or Twitter, now I go, I'm going to apply a healthy level of cynicism. Same thing about when I read anything from any news, news session these days. Who's trustworthy these days? People may trust Breitbart and Fox, and others might trust New York Times and BBC and The Guardian, and others might trust The Telegraph or whoever. But the point is, I very sadly am now assigning a level of cynicism to everything I read. I'm like, is it true? Like, that's the first question I have to ask. And I don't know, Minter, like, did you even think that even a year ago? I think since the Brexit referendum, I've started to really head in that direction. So for me, the last 3-4 years, I've been really increasingly more so, and especially during this pandemic.
Well, let's hope it's widely shared, because I think it's healthy to have cynicism. It's always, I've written quite a number of times around the idea of a CEO, Chief Ethics Officer.
Yeah.
Yet I think actually it behooves the CEO, him or herself, to be the ethics officer, because it's kind of a full mindset. It's not something you can delegate to something else. And the second thing that's interesting is that in the media space, it's necessary to have someone who is in charge of ethics, as in when you're right in traditional media, there's always an ethics officer.
Yeah.
And to the extent companies can consider themselves like a Red Bull, a media company that happens to sell an energy drink, it does feel like there is a need for more ethics brought into even traditional businesses. And it's not because you can do it that you should do it when it comes to innovation.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're 100% in agreement with each other. I think the issue, though, like with the chief executive officer only being the one that's ethical, I mean, I think they need to surround themselves with people like that. They need to surround themselves with people that are willing to challenge them. Because don't forget, they have to answer to their shareholders, whether they're private shareholders or public market shareholders. And actually, when you have those kind of forces at play, that's interesting to me. But actually, if you look at Facebook share price, like after the Cambridge Analytica scandal, two things I observed: how rapidly the share price dropped. Several billion dropped off the share price. And again, that happened earlier this year in the Black Lives Matter scenario, again with Facebook. But the other thing is what was interesting to me is in the Cambridge Analytica scandal, Facebook took 2 weeks to reply to a lot of these accusations. And, we all know exactly what they were trying to do, which is they're probably trying to come up with the right formulated answer.
Narrative.
Yeah, a right narrative, because they probably, it probably went out of control and they didn't realize what happened. So they're trying to dig beneath and figure out what happened. But actually, I think that 2-week delay in creating that narrative really harmed the share price. So how does the chief executive, respond to their shareholders? And that's in a big corporate setting. But actually, if you've got a CEO of a young startup and the shareholders are angel investors and VCs, and they're talking about the valuation of the next round, which is just wrong, but because they can get a cheaper deal because it's the pandemic. And I tell you, I've seen a lot of that right now, where I've seen some very poor investor behavior against a couple of the startups that I'm advising directly, where they thought, well, we can get a cheaper deal, so let's just go for it. And I was like, that's really poor form. You should be there to support the founder who is really trying to keep their business afloat. And when you're a young seed funded company, every day counts, and every penny counts. So how do you get that runway to even December? So, I've seen a lot of near deaths of startups, and I've also seen some amazing startups that have gone under because the investors were just not willing to put money in. And that's me speaking out against myself sometimes, right? So I think we all have something to say here. It's not just the big corporates, but I do think the ethics side is huge, and it's very important. It's doing the right thing for the company and the right thing for the founder. But let's also be commercial here. People are investing in innovation because they want to make money, right? They want a return on that. Venture capitalists do. Corporates, want to drive efficiency because it means, return on the share price. Founders want that return as well. And government wants a return for their population, right? They want more jobs. They want, more wealth creation. They want more security, and bringing everyone up with them as the country grows. So there is a returns-based thinking that sometimes can be contrarian to the ethics side.
Well, when you mentioned shareholders or the VCs, and that's why I was sort of my line of investigation was to what extent the way people evaluate innovation might be changing, because some of us really feel the need to be protecting the planet, doing better things for the world, finding purpose. We got the CEO letter of 181 CEOs who suggested that it's not just about the bottom line and
Yes, yeah.
paying the piper of the shareholder. And yet so many, the words I like to use is innovation is the lifeblood of any company. It can be innovation in different areas of the company. So it can be the product, but it can also be the way you communicate. It can be the way you run the factory. So innovation can be displayed or executed in many different ways. But I wonder to what extent, until we get shareholders to buy in on the value of purpose, the value of ethics, well, then there's always going to have to be a rollback. Well, nice thing to have, Bindi, but you know what? I need my money.
So I think one other observation I'd make is so millennials and Gen Zs in the next 20 years will be 75% of our workforce. And let's face it, that's how they both think as generations. They're much more purpose driven. And they're the ones that are founding companies with that purpose. There are VC funds popping up more and more that invest in people with that purpose. There's still a commercial, bent to how they're investing, but the whole reason for being is having that purpose. And you look at corporates who employ these generations, and they're saying, guys, you need to do better. We only are going to work with you if you do better. And actually, if you think about the Google walkouts, that's a great example. Um, and so that's a really good example of how certain generations are impacting how a lot of these chief executives need to think. So I do think that as a society, we're moving in the right direction, but actually there's other forces as well that are at play. So for VCs, they have the LP, right? So the person that's putting the money in the fund, and there is an expectation of returns. So the VCs are going to say when they put money in, are we going to get our money back at 3 to 5x, right? That's the discussion in the deal room. That's how it works, because that's what the limited partner wants. And even the LP that's putting money into the social impact funds, there is an expectation of return, those big hedge funds. So it's a value chain. If one doesn't change, then the rest will struggle to change. So I think you've got to think about that overall change and thinking across the whole value chain, which for me is always interesting. And actually, because of the work I do, I'm understanding more and more elements of that value chain and where they come from and why they come from where they come from in terms of thinking.
My friend is a Frenchman, you may know him, Nicolas Collin. He has a newsletter, it's called the European Straits, which is always very interesting. And he talks a lot about these topics. I would say he's my main source for a lot of this stuff.
Yeah.
He wrote, there's not just one framework for investing in tech startups. Beware any advice, including mine. I thought that was rather funny.
I agree with him. That's great. I would say the same thing.
One of the last area of discussion I wanted to have with you, Bindi, is with regard to this gap that you facilitate, that you network in between, which is between corporates, startups, governments, and investors, of course, the finance world. What do you see as the biggest issue in getting the fluidity between these groups? Let's say a big corporate that wants to be more innovative, wants to onboard startupness or a startup, or is it the way that the investors are looking at it? What are the big challenges that you face in networking through or facilitating this gap anyway?
I think people are focused, and I'll go back to the very beginning of where I said, I cast myself as ideally a talented generalist, right? Understand where all of them are coming from. But most people are in their silo is a negative word. This is not what I mean as negative, but they're on their focus, they're on their path, and they're sticking on their path. And the founder is trying to disrupt something with their technology and trying to get users for the technology and take it to the next level of funding, if that's the path they're going on. The corporate is using innovation to increase efficiencies or create new business models or move into new markets and create shareholder value. The VCs are all about the returns, typically. And government, as I said before, is about improving the lives of their citizens. And they don't necessarily think outside of that path. They don't think, well, actually, is what I'm doing, for example, as a government policymaker, really going to improve the needs of these startups? And the government, for example, has to think about every type of person from every walk of life. So they're much more, they're broader thinking because they have to think of whole countries and the like. But what I try to do is I have built an insight because I've worked quite deeply in each of those areas now. So I try to provide a translation service and go, actually, if you think of it this way, this is what they're going for. So a startup raising from a VC, I can go, actually, that VC is probably not going to be interested in you because these are the last 5 investments they've made, and you can see they're kind of focused in this space and therefore, probably not wise. Oh, actually, your business plan, you're trying to get to $1 million revenue this year and 5 million next. How viable is that? Because actually the VC is going to dig under the numbers and really see, can you get to 5 million?
Or
Oh,
it's just an Excel spreadsheet
yeah,
gone
it's
wrong.
not just a spreadsheet. You got to prove you can get to it. And then the corporates who are like, oh, I want to buy from these cute little startups, but then it turns out they end up killing the startup because they buy from them, and then the startup is so overwhelmed by the questions from that corporate, so the startup doesn't know when they need to step out. And the poor corporate didn't know any better, and so it's about providing that translation services. So I think there is so much value in trying to help bridge that gap, because ultimately, for me, you asked me earlier, what else makes me passionate? What makes me passionate is when I see those connections create magic, and that magic might be revenue, that magic might be they get customers, that magic might be they're creating more jobs for that local council area. Whatever the magic is, for me, it's the meeting of the two of them that creates that magic. And that for me is, the most important thing. And because I've worked in all of those spaces, I can at the very least have a good level of knowledge. And I can talk like a corporate, but I can also say, well, I myself am a founder, so I understand that paying that credit card bill or paying next month's rent and not paying myself salary for the last 5 years, it's a real pain.
Mhm.
And so I understand and feel the pain that you're going through in a way that a comfortable corporate executive might not understand. And it's all of those kind of things. So
In your work, you work at the on the European Innovation Council,
yeah.
and you mentioned before that the government needs to think more broadly. The cynical mentor says, well, they need to think about how they're going to get reelected, as opposed to necessarily always doing what's good for everybody else. To what extent do you believe that the government can be, should be, is a stimulus of innovation?
It's a great question. um, I think government should be there to facilitate. I'm a private sector person, always have been, always will be. And I think the government should be there to facilitate and take down the barriers that might be in the way of innovation and creation. So the EIC, I sit on their board, and what I'd say about them is they're all civil servants, right? So they work for European Commission, and the one political person at the top, the minister, who is chosen by the government. Every president or prime minister will choose that minister, and then that minister will lobby for the position. So the Minister of Innovation is the one that the EIC sits under. What I would say is they've actually been really open-minded and open to, we've been really hard on them, for example. So they've chosen 20 of us from academic and tech and innovators world across Europe. And we've been really hard on them. We've just said, you need to think about this, you need to get out of the way of this. And to their credit, they've actually listened and created things along the way. Ultimately, what they did is they saw that there was a gap in the deep tech space. We're going back to deep tech, where actually a researcher from a university might come up with a piece of IP, but for that IP to get to a commercial level and built to a level where it's able to go to market and it's being able to be sold to customers, that's a 5-year journey. But how on earth is that creator supposed to fund that? How are they supposed to surround themselves with a team? And that's where a lot of these government grants come in, right? And so, but then they're like the government body's like, we need to get out of the way, and then let the private sector step in and take the company to the next level. Ultimately, for them, they want the next unicorn and decacorn in Europe. We don't have that many. So for them, they're like, we need to create groundbreaking innovation in Europe. And there's a chart that we were shown in Brussels end of 2018, and the top 25 internet companies in the world were 100% US and Chinese, nothing from Europe. And that's just disappointing. And why are we doing that? And that's a whole other discussion. But we need to lay the groundwork so that these companies that have the potential to become unicorns and decacorns, UiPath just became one, for example, so that they'll stay in Europe as opposed to relocating to Silicon Valley, where a lot of that kind of funding is. The money should be here, and let them have the funding they need to get to a level to be commercialized. So I think that's kind of the role to me.
It sounded, in listening to you, it sounds like they're good at helping look a little bit longer term as opposed to the VC 3 months quick flip. They give that sort of bigger vision. And I can't help but think of my friends in Estonia and the way that they work. And I think it's a phenomenal example of being really business friendly. I mean, because their existence depends on it. But the way so many of these larger government institutions run by civil servants who may be extremely intelligent, but just not practical when it comes to business, I tend to think, exactly like you, how on earth can they get out of the way of innovation?
Well, I think they have to embrace wanting input from people like me. I like to say I'm a professional troublemaker. So I'm a troublemaker with class. I'm always asking and poking and blah, blah, blah. I'm not like a troublemaker where it causes them consternation, but I'm like, guys, have you thought about this? Have you thought about that? Have you thought about this? Have you thought about that? You know, that's the whole point about being on an NED or on a board or an advisor. You don't tell them what to do. You just ask the questions that make them think outside of the path that they're going. Have you thought about this? Or, well, why this? Why that? Just so that way they're more comfortable with the direction that they're going in. So yeah, professional troublemaker. It's quite fun.
Bindi, on that wonderful, troublesome idea. Thanks for coming on. How can anyone get in touch with you, track you down, follow what you're up to, get involved with you somehow?
Yeah, I mean, you can check my personal website, bindikaria.com, or if you do bindiventures.com, it leads to my site. Or just send me an email to bindi@bindiventures.com, or reach out to me through LinkedIn or Twitter @BindiK. And always happy to chat.
Beautiful. I'll put that in the show notes. Thanks again, Bindi. Great to see you. Stay well, stay cool, and stay sane.
You too, Minter. Lovely to chat.
Thanks for having listened to this recording of the Minter Dialogue Show. You'll find the show notes and other blog posts on minterdial.com. If you enjoyed the show, please head over to iTunes to give a rating and review. And to finish, here's a song I wrote with Stephanie Singer, A Convinced Man.
A stranger tucked around me, precipitating the danger. To feel free, trust is the reason. Still, I won't toe the line. I sit here passively, hope for your respect, anticipating the thrill of your intellect. Maybe I tell myself there's no use in me lying. I'm a convinced man, building an urge. I'm a convinced man, to live and die submerged. A convinced man, in the arms of a woman. I'm a convinced man, challenge my fate. I'm a convinced man, competition's innate. A convinced man, in the arms of a woman. Despise revenges and struggle with deceit. Live for the challenge so life's not incomplete. What's wrong with challenge? I know soon we all die. I like the feel of a stranger tucked around me, precipitating the danger. To feel free, trust in my reason.